May 27, 1943, Central Pacific. The sea was calm, but the sky held scattered cloud layers that made visibility unreliable at low altitude. The B-24 from the 7th Air Force's 307th Bomb Group had been running a search mission for a missing crew. It was supposed to be a routine sweep over open water. Lieutenant Louis Zamperini, the bombardier, kept his eyes on the horizon and his headset ready for pilot updates. The aircraft had been known for mechanical faults. The crew treated every hour in the air as a calculated risk. The right inboard engine began to sputter. The vibration ran through the fuselage the way a trained airman recognizes as trouble. The pilot ordered a check. Instruments confirmed a drop in oil pressure. The crew shifted weight and prepared for potential failure procedures. Minutes later, another engine dropped power. The bailout option was discussed, but altitude was too low to guarantee safe chutes. Ditching procedures were initiated. Zamperini braced against his station bulkhead. He secured loose gear and made sure the life rafts were positioned for quick access. When the B-24 hit the water, the impact tore the aircraft apart. Several crewmen were lost in the break. The survivors surfaced amid fuel slicks and debris. Zamperini kicked free of cables and swam hard until he reached one of the inflated rafts. The immediate tactical situation was simple. 3 men remained alive. They had 2 rafts, minimal rations, a flare gun, and a patch kit. Their radios were gone. Their maps were gone. Their last known position had been sent before the engines failed, but there was no certainty the signal had been received. The Pacific around them was open and silent. No aircraft could be heard. No ships were visible. Zamperini carried out basic checks. He inspected the raft seams. He accounted for the survival kit contents. He assessed the injuries of the pilot and the tail gunner. Both were shaken, but functional. Their priority was to stay tethered to each other, maintain raft integrity, and prepare for drifting. The current pulled west. Winds were steady. Nightfall was approaching. The officer in the best condition would manage supplies. Zamperini volunteered. He examined the emergency rations, a small number of chocolate bars, a few tins of water, a basic fishing setup. All of it was limited. Their chance of recovery depended on radio reports from the bomber before it crashed. None of them assumed rescue would arrive quickly. Sharks circled before the sun dropped. Their fins cut the surface in slow movements. The men kept limbs inside the rubber walls and stayed still. The only weapon they had was an oar that had floated loose from the wreck. They used it to tap the water and discourage the sharks when they came too close. Night brought colder air but calm seas. The men stayed alert in turns. Zamperini looked at the star field overhead and calculated how far they might drift by morning. He noted winds from the east and slight swells from the southeast. Each detail mattered. Survival on the water was an accumulation of correct, small choices. They settled in. No rescue lights appeared. No engine sounds approached. The Pacific remained open and dark. Morning brought a thin line of light to the east. The sea was steady, with small swells that lifted the rafts in slow motion. Zamperini checked the condition of the rubber seams again. No new leaks. The other 2 airmen stayed quiet while they recovered from the crash. Dehydration was not yet a threat, but morale was fragile. The men had been trained to handle emergency procedures, but few crews ever expected to drift for long. Zamperini set the day's priorities: establish a ration schedule, inventory equipment, evaluate injuries. He gave each man a measured sip of water and held off on the chocolate. Early consumption would only weaken their chances later. They talked briefly about navigation. With no compass and no maps, they were at the mercy of current and wind. Their only asset was that the Pacific search grid would include their approximate last known radio call. If the call had been received, By midday, heat built fast. The yellow raft skin reflected light upward and made it difficult to keep eyes open. They used small pieces of cloth to cover their heads. Sweat loss was unavoidable. Zamperini reminded them to stay calm and reduce movement. Every action burned water they could not replace. The pilot attempted to scan for aircraft, but the sky was empty. Sharks returned. This time they circled closer. The movements were predictable. Slow passes, occasional nudges at the raft. Zamperini kept the oar ready. A controlled tap on the snout was usually enough to redirect them. The men stayed centered in the raft to avoid tipping. Even a brief fall into the water could be fatal. Hunger set in by late afternoon. Zamperini allowed small bites of the ration bars, enough for morale, not enough to waste. They reviewed the fishing gear: a basic line, several hooks, and a small hand net. They knew fishing would be a long shot without bait, but it remained an option. For now, they conserved energy. The second night was more difficult. The men could hear distant splashes that suggested larger predators moving beneath them. The rafts flexed slightly with every swell. Sleep came in short intervals. Zamperini stayed awake longer than the others, listening for aircraft engines. Nothing came. On the third morning, the situation shifted from short-term emergency to long-term survival. Their bodies were already showing signs of dehydration. Their lips dried. Movement slowed. The men spoke less to preserve strength. Zamperini checked the sun's position and noted drift patterns. The rafts continued westward. No land appeared on any horizon line. He decided they needed fish. They used a small piece of bird feather stuck in the kit as improvised lure material. The pilot held the line steady while Zamperini guided the hook. It took hours before anything approached. When a small fish bit, they pulled it in quickly and killed it with a single strike. It was not enough for full nourishment, but protein mattered. They shared portions evenly. Birds flew overhead in the afternoon, low altitude. Their presence indicated potential schools of fish nearby. Zamperini watched them carefully, but did not waste energy reaching. He noted only their direction and flight pattern. Every detail contributed to the larger mental map he was forming of their drift. Late on the third day, clouds gathered. A short squall passed across the rafts. The men opened their mouths and caught rain. They filled the small emergency tins, using the raft's surface as a catchment. It was the first real gain in their water supply. The storm moved on quickly, but it bought them time. Time was their only currency. That evening, the men felt the weight of the situation. Rescue had not appeared. Their drift continued. Their supplies were thinning. Zamperini reminded them of a simple battlefield truth. Survival was a sequence of decisions. No panic, no wasted movement, no unnecessary talk. Control what can be controlled, endure what cannot. The sun dropped. Temperature fell. The Pacific flattened in the darkness. They settled into rotation again. One man awake, two resting. The rafts held steady. By dawn on the fourth day, the men were already showing the slow movements common to dehydration fatigue. Their joints felt stiff. Their faces were sunburned from continuous exposure. Zamperini checked each man for signs of worsening condition. The pilot had a shallow cut on his arm from the crash that had begun to irritate, but there were no infections yet. The tail gunner showed persistent dizziness, but could still follow instructions. Heat began building earlier than usual. The sky was clear and the swells consistent. With no cloud cover, the sun pressed down without relief. Zamperini reduced daytime activity to essential movements only. Rationing became even more strict. A few sips of water at controlled intervals, no food in the morning. They needed to stretch supplies as far as possible. Sharks increased in number. Their movement formed a loose perimeter around the rafts. The pattern repeated throughout the day. Slow approaches from below, occasional bumps against the rubber. Zamperini kept pressure on the oar to maintain deterrence. At times, one shark lifted its snout over the raft's edge. The men struck quickly, controlled, enough to make it back off. The raft walls held, but the constant harassment raised tension. By afternoon, hunger sharpened. The single fish from the previous day had barely slowed the decline of their energy. They tried the line again. Hours passed with no strikes. The ocean was open and quiet. No surface disturbance indicated fish activity. Zamperini reviewed alternatives. They could wait for birds. They could attempt the hand net. Both low probability, but every attempt mattered. A fortunate break arrived near sunset. A small seabird landed on the edge of the raft, drawn by stillness. The men held position. Minimal movement. When the bird shifted its weight, Zamperini grabbed fast and clean. The bird died instantly. It provided a small amount of meat and, more importantly, bait for the fishing line. They divided the meat evenly. It was barely more than a mouthful, but it lifted morale. Using the bird remains as bait, they tried fishing again through the twilight. The line jerked once, then again. A medium-sized fish struck. They hauled it in carefully, aware that blood in the water could escalate shark activity. They cleaned it quickly and kept the portions small but steady. Protein intake improved their conditions slightly before nightfall. Shark behavior intensified after the fish was caught. The scent triggered more aggressive movements. Several sharks rammed the raft in short bursts. The rubber flexed under impact, but did not tear. The men stayed low and centered. Zamperini kept the oar extended to redirect any attempt to climb onto the raft. The harassment lasted for hours before the sharks settled back into slower patterns. By the 7th day, the men had entered a new phase of physical decline. Their ribs showed clearly. Their movements became automatic. Speech came in short sentences. But their survival procedures had become disciplined. Morning checks, weather estimation, ration control, fishing attempts, rest cycles. Rain returned that evening, light at first, then steady enough to refill water tins. They caught what they could. Each drop was a tactical gain. Water meant another day, another series of decisions they could push through. Zamperini made mental notes of drift speed. Based on the swells and the position of the sun each afternoon, he judged they were moving steadily west. No signs of land, no aircraft sightings, no distant engine noise, only open ocean. They still had 2 rafts. One carried the majority of equipment. The other provided extra buoyancy and safety margin. The tethers held. As long as they remained intact, the men could distribute weight to prevent fatigue in the rubber seams. By day 10, hunger returned with greater force. Fishing success varied. Sometimes they pulled in 2 small fish, sometimes none. The bird strike never repeated. The rafts carried the smell of salt, rubber, and dried fish residue. The men had stopped noticing. Their bodies adapted to minimal intake. Slow breathing, controlled movements, reduced talking. The routine was their anchor. Without it, panic could take hold. Zamperini watched the others closely. Discipline remained intact. The Pacific stayed open, current steady, no rescue in sight. By the 2nd week, the men were functioning on instinct more than strength. Their muscles had thinned. Their eyes were sunken. Every movement required deliberate effort. But their survival procedures remained consistent. Morning checks, tether inspection, water assessment, fishing, attempts, no wasted steps. Heat became their primary adversary. Direct sun exposure forced them to lie flat inside the raft, with cloth pulled over their heads. The rubber walls amplified the temperature. Zamperini rotated positions to balance the strain on each man. Dehydration signs came in waves, cracked lips, slowed speech, lightheaded moments. Controlled sips kept them functioning, but at a minimal level. Sharks continued to shadow the rafts. Their presence became routine. Some were small reef types, others were larger, deep gray shapes that surfaced without warning. They watched the rafts as if testing weaknesses. Any time a limb neared the edge, they moved in fast. The men learned to stay centered and still. Around day 15, the weather shifted. A low-pressure system approached from the southeast. Winds rose and pushed steady swells under the rafts. Clouds formed heavy layers overhead. The temperature dropped slightly, providing brief relief from the heat. Then rain arrived in bursts, hard, cold, and carried by winds strong enough to tilt the rafts. Rain meant opportunity. They used the raft surfaces to gather water. Some of it washed over the edges before they could secure it. But enough was collected to refill each tin. Wave activity increased. Every few minutes, a swell lifted the raft and dropped it again. The tethers held. Zamperini reinforced knots to prevent friction wear. Losing one raft in heavy weather would reduce their margin for survival. Fishing improved in the turbulent conditions. Fish rose closer to the surface. Short strikes on the baited hook produced sporadic catches. They ate small portions raw and stored the rest as long as possible. With no salt and no shade, the fish dried quickly. Spoilage forced them to consume most of it within hours. Navigation attempts remained basic. Zamperini used the sun's position to maintain rough orientation. The drift stayed consistent toward the west-northwest. He estimated they had traveled hundreds of miles since the crash. With no islands visible and no shipping lanes crossed, the probability of random rescue remained low. Their best chance remained endurance. On day 20, the tail gunner weakened significantly. He struggled to sit upright. His breathing was shallow. He drank but could not eat more than a few bites. Zamperini monitored him closely and shifted more tasks to himself and the pilot. The Pacific did not slow for their condition. Current and wind continued to move them west. Birds returned occasionally, high altitude, never close enough to grab. Their presence indicated marine life below, so the men increased fishing attempts. Some days they caught nothing. Water remained the critical factor. When clouds appeared, morale lifted. When the sky stayed clear for days, pressure increased. By day 25, their bodies had adapted to minimal intake, but muscle loss continued. Zamperini forced himself to stay alert. Any sign of approaching weather, any chance to gather water, any new behavior from the sharks. Vigilance kept them alive. A major storm hit around day 28. Winds came in from the east. Swells rose high enough to threaten capsizing. The men secured themselves inside the raft by gripping rope loops and staying low. Rain came in heavy sheets. They captured as much water as possible, but the priority shifted to raft stability. Waves broke over the walls. The tethers strained. One knot slipped, but held long enough for Zamperini to retie it by feel in the dark. Hours passed before the storm eased. When morning came, the sea had flattened. The men were soaked and exhausted, but alive. Water supplies were strong thanks to the storm. Food was limited but manageable. They had survived one of the harshest phases of Pacific drift. On day 30, the horizon changed slightly. A faint variation in cloud patterns. No land, but different air movement. The men could not confirm direction, but it suggested they were entering new waters. Their drift continued westward. By this stage, they no longer thought in terms of days. They thought in terms of next tasks, next cup of water, next attempt at fish, next weather change. Their bodies weakened, but their discipline remained intact. They had passed the point where most crews perished. The Pacific remained wide. The current carried them toward unknown territory. By the 5th week, the men no longer tracked time with precision. Their bodies moved slowly, guided by routine rather than strength. Skin was cracked from sun exposure. Faces were hollow. Muscle tone had nearly disappeared. But the rafts were still afloat. The tethers were still secure. Water and occasional fish kept them alive just enough to continue. Shark activity persisted, but had become predictable. Slow passes in the morning, more aggressive behavior at dusk. The men stayed centered and silent when the larger sharks surfaced. At this stage, they had no ability to repel extended attacks. They relied on stillness and the knowledge that the sharks were more interested in testing than committing. Around day 40, the pilot began to weaken significantly. His speech was slow. He struggled to sit upright without support. Zamperini split tasks between himself and the tail gunner, though the gunner was barely stronger. Every action took calculated effort. Rations were minimal. Water had been steady only because intermittent squalls passed through the area. They caught what they could, but not enough to restore strength. The Pacific changed in small but noticeable ways. Cloud formations became more common. Bird presence increased. The men tracked these signs carefully. Both indicated proximity to island chains or shallower waters. No land appeared, but their drift pattern suggested they were entering lanes frequented by patrol aircraft or ships. On one morning near day 45, a distant engine droned overhead. Zamperini scanned the sky. A single-engine aircraft approached from the north. It was not American. Its profile and wing configuration identified it as Japanese. The men lay flat to avoid detection, but the aircraft circled. A second pass confirmed they had been spotted. The aircraft opened fire in short, controlled bursts. Rounds struck the water around the rafts. Some penetrated the rubber walls. The men rolled into the water, using the raft's underside as cover. Sharks moved in quickly. Zamperini used his hands and feet to push them away, while staying submerged enough to avoid further strafing. The aircraft made several more passes before departing. When it left, the men returned to the rafts. Damage was present. Several holes. One raft was at risk of deflating. Zamperini used the patch kit immediately. Slow, methodical work. Every repair was life or death. By evening, the rafts held enough air to stay afloat. They redistributed weight to reduce stress on the damaged sections. The day had cost them significant strength. The pilot was barely conscious. The tail gunner could no longer sit upright. On day 47, a ship appeared on the western horizon. Low profile, dark hull, no Allied markings. Zamperini watched through narrowed eyes. The ship closed distance steadily. It was Japanese, a patrol vessel. The men had no ability to evade, no strength to maneuver, no equipment to signal. Capture was certain. The only tactical decision left was to maintain composure and prevent any sudden movement that might provoke gunfire. The ship deployed a small boat. Japanese sailors approached with rifles ready. Orders were shouted. The men complied. They were lifted aboard with minimal resistance. Their physical condition made them unable to stand without assistance. Once aboard the patrol vessel, water was given in controlled amounts, not for comfort, but to ensure the prisoners stayed conscious during transport. The crew searched their rafts and secured remaining equipment. The Pacific drift was over. Survival on open water had ended. Zamperini assessed the situation. Capture meant interrogation and imprisonment. The tactical reality was clear. They were now prisoners of war, and a new phase of endurance awaited. But they were alive. After 47 days adrift, the fact remained. They had survived one of the most extreme survival ordeals of the Pacific.